other aspects, and being in Bosch, just a little bit about myself. I have been in Bosch for almost 20 years, taking care of various verticals, and currently I am also heading the software tools, which primarily are also working in this technology. So it's very interesting times that we are in, and a lot of collaboration is possible to get on this technology chain and be successful. So the social impact is there because a lot of things which are dependent on time, productivity, those problems are going to be solved, and people are impacted, having less or more work to do on creative things rather than spending their time traveling from place A to B.
Just to comment, like in the Silicon Valley, a startup, when it finally decides to sell out and find a buyer, the first thing, when you get the good money, you go and buy. The number one thing that you go and buy, after you get acquired by another company and you make your millions, guess what you buy? Any guesses? It would be a car called Tesla. That's the number one thing people go and buy. And if you see the car, you will not know whether it's a mechanical device or it's an IoT, or a computer. So that's where we are. So it's all merging into this vast area for this economy. So thanks, Justin, for that oversight. Now let's bring this back to a little bit of what's happening in India. And if I can start with Kishore. We talked a lot about IoT, right? And we talked about the CS conference which is happening right now. One of the things in the CS conference, one of the big draws this time, is LG has this device which is supposed to clean airports. But it's not that. It's got this whole bunch of gizmos to figure out what is the air humidity, it can connect to internet, knows which airport it is, it knows the design of the airport, a whole bunch of stuff. Now in India today, we are a country where we are struggling with, like, lack of jobs are a challenge. How do you reconcile this whole movement of a digital economy to jobs and the situation that we have? We are not only seeing that in India, we are seeing that across the world. Do you see IoT coming in the way of people getting jobs? How do you see it?
Yeah, I think most of the management students will be familiar with the S-curve, right? Always at the end of the S-curve, there is some amount of tapering. And in this whole disruptive everything, disruptive economy, disruptive technologies, it comes to the who by situation. If you don't get into IoT or you don't adopt technologies. Of course, India, is now moving from a low-income group economy to a middle-income group. And to make India competitive, one of the most important steps is this whole digitization process. You can see it happening from the national optical fiber networks. So jobs are being created there. For example, laying the infrastructure. So newer jobs will come to the fore, and I'm sure. From the days of computerization, we have seen every time, you're going to take this, as Joseph Schumpeter coined this Schumpeterian evolution, you're taking the next leapfrog thing. There are consequences, there are challenges that have to be addressed. But over a period of time, the economy benefits because newer jobs are created to manage, to sustain, and to evolve those technologies till the next thing comes. And we are in a country with people who are really entrepreneurial. You will see people coming out with ingenious solutions. So for example, some time back, you could say the seeds of IoT started from the street in India. It was then end-to-end technology. Way back in 2002, I used to have a startup, and I had one technopreneur from Coimbatore. He was developing an SMS-based motor controller for the smart irrigation or rather remote irrigation. And I'm sure most people in Coimbatore are familiar with that product. you could start and switch off an irrigation pump set remotely by sending an SMS. But India also had a problem where, the power conversion, sometimes you don't have three-phase power or two-phase power. So, what I could make out was there are people thinking of newer ways. And there's a huge ecosystem which is working on, how do you make these dumb or mute devices smart. And over a period of time, you will see new applications coming to the forefront and newer ideas taking place. You see how people are using smartphones today to create a marketplace in the fishing communities. A bunch of boats, it goes a flotilla, there's a mothership, there are smaller doors and smaller boats. And they are also extracting, trading information on where the shoal of fish is, how it can be, what is the market price on shore. And depending on that, they determine how much the catch should be. And even before the catch of fish reaches the ports or the shore, it is already sold. So you will see that happening more and more in India. And if we don't do this, because you see a lot of economies, you look at South Korea, you look at other places, they see, or for example, not when they come from Germany, they know that they don't have the human capital. And the best way they can address this is through these Industry 4.0 or what you call IoT technologies that would make them globally competitive. So, we cannot find other asymmetric means to compete. So we have to, get onto the bandwagon quickly and, get into these technologies. And I think that's the way forward. It's also the reality.
This is an interesting question which has been around, I think, for years. I was actually reading, there was a time where 90% of the people in the world did agriculture, and they sort of moved away. And even at that time, this debate was coming up. There is, in fact, a term for this. It's called technological unemployment. And after a period of time, people get unemployed because of the evolution of technology. So the optimistic me says this has happened so many times in the past that jobs will get created. We don't know what they are. If you look at US right now, where it's a huge service economy, I'm sure 70, 80 years back people had not realized what would happen. So I actually think yes, technology evolution is needed. Productivity will actually go up, and I think people will figure ways in which service jobs will tend to become a lot more than that. So I'm quite optimistic in that point.
I mean, you can have touched on the comment I was about to make. It's going to be a job switch. Like I'm old enough, like I said, I launched my product in CSI in 1981. That was just a year before the huge transformation happened in 1992. Now, we did the transformation to a large extent because our backs were against the wall. But you know what happened? This country just rocketed. I mean, where we are today, sitting out here and really discussing this topic, wouldn't that happen if we had not taken some bold? Sure, there were short-term challenges. But we came up with this whole IT industry, and I don't know, maybe you might have a better idea how many people we employ. But that industry did not exist in 1984, right? And that happened because people moved from some other sector to this sector, and that's basically what happened. But that then is a nice segue into my next question, which I'd like to ask is, how is the education? We have students, and yes, we have a few professors here. How do you think the education will have to be at the basis of this transformation? Okay? So, where do you see that happening, and what is your expectation from the education industry, if I can use that word?
Sure, and very interesting one. Just to set the context and background. I have founded 2 companies of my own, and the first one was EduTech, and it was primarily to virtualize universities and have a cross-fertilization of knowledge across countries, which in a way HDX has started and MIT has started to share their thesis and live classes online. How many of you have access to those? 1% of the room, right? And that platform is ours. So there is a huge disruption that is going to happen in education industry. And there are 3 levels of disruption which will happen, and I'm sure many of you would be living that change as well. One is at the pedagogic level. What existed just 7 years before, which is to start semester 1 from a subject which could be like C or C, right, or C1, C2, C3 in 3 semesters. Now they are being challenged, right? Why cannot a DBMS be inserted into semester 1? So which means the knowledge horizon, the definition in itself is changing, right? What should be my benchmark of basic elementary education? That is being challenged, right? So which means that a person will not be exposed to Java language in college. They may get exposed in their 10th classes. Right? So there is a rationalization and radicalization of subjects which is happening. Now why that is happening? It is happening because our patterns are changing. Chidil asked you that how many of you have transacted online, and almost 100% of you said that, which means you want convenience in life, right? If you want convenience in life, there's lots that goes behind, right? Means a good movie, though it looks like 3 hours, but there is a plethora of work of years before that, which means the whole rationalization of pedagogic space in terms of content, that is changing and will evolve further.
The first one is social engineering. We'll cover, this is a summary slide, we'll cover this in detail. We'll look at 3 techniques there: spam, phishing, and Trojanized software. And then finally, we'll also talk about vulnerabilities and exploits. In specific, we'll talk about a concept called a zero-day exploit, which is actually very effective in actually compromising systems. So what is social engineering? Social engineering simply is the art of manipulating people. In the physical world, you might have heard about con men who actually go and pretend that they are somebody else, and they try to actually, usually they are asking for money or something else. And essentially the same thing happens in the online world as well. But the way it happens is very subtle. It usually happens through, so one form is unsolicited email. And spam is still actually very, very effective technique that is employed to actually infect endpoints. And the volume is staggering. It's about 28 billion spam emails that we see on a daily basis. But the general technique is, it will urge you to take an action. The common themes are like adult content, court notices, IRS notices, things that have a sense of urgency, and they will prompt you to take an action. Right? Usually it is clicking on something. You click a link and your problem will be solved. Or you open this attachment, things like that. And the second technique there is that they actually use masquerading file names. So executable content actually comes masqueraded as PDFs and GIFs images. And unsuspecting users who are not actually paying attention to the type of attachment they are opening or the type of file they are opening will end up running executable content on their laptops or phones. So let's look at an example. So this was one of the spam campaigns that was quite effective about, I think, a year and a half ago. So as you will see here, this is a notice of appearance at a court, and it is saying that you have to prepare documents for a certain case, and you have to appear in front of the court. It also has a name of a district clerk, things like that. So generally, it shows some sense of urgency. But there are some interesting things to note here. First of all, it came from a RU domain, right? So it looks like a US district court, but it came from an RU domain. The second thing is, it has a very generic greeting, which means the attacker does not have enough information about you. Most likely, this is a mass spam campaign, right? It has a very generic greeting. And the third thing is, it has a malicious payload. And this is the attachment that actually contained executable code that ran on your PC. So the second example that we look at is a technique called phishing. Phishing is attempting to gain confidential information by pretending you are somebody else. Usually it's like a bank or any other financial institution that has access to sensitive confidential data, and they will make you believe that you are actually visiting the bank's website. So you might actually get an email which looks like from the bank that says you have to re-authenticate yourselves for some reason. And if you don't do it by this date, there are some penalties. And there'll be a bank link there that actually looks like your regular bank, ICICI or HDFC Bank. But when you click on that link, you will also go to a page that actually looks very much like your bank web page. They'll use the exact logos, the screen layout, the things that are used to. And they'll ask for your username and password. And a lot of unsuspecting users would actually enter the username and password, and they would be entering that data onto the attacker's website, not the bank's website. So this is a technique called phishing. A particular form of phishing is extremely effective, and it's called spear phishing. What happens in spear phishing is that the attackers are attempting to target specific individuals in an organization. So they either target a sector, like oil and natural gas, or banking, or retail, and then they go after specific individuals in that, either managers or people in the IT department. Why? Because once there is an initial point of infiltration into a customer's network, then they want to be able to laterally move and scan what data they have access to. And if they compromise the computer of a person who has access, then that means that they are able to use probably cache credentials on his laptop to be able to access a data store that contains more sensitive or confidential data. And this is why it's important for them to be able to identify the target. And the way they do this is by having a fairly lengthy reconnaissance period. The reconnaissance period, they actually collect a lot of personal information about their victim. Unlike the previous example you saw, this email will be extremely specific to that individual. It may know the names of your friends. It might talk about the vacation that you had last month. It will be that specific. So it's a high value target they're going after, and they craft the email, and there is a higher chance, so the volume is low, but there is a higher probability that the victim is going to fall for it, because it has a lot of relevant context that the victim is familiar with. So this is called spear phishing, and this has actually been quite effective as well. So here is an example. This is not a spear phishing campaign. This is a regular campaign. So this looks like a notice email that came from the RBI. You'll see some interesting things. One, it has an RBI logo, so it looks a little bit authentic. It's also asking for a lot of sensitive and confidential information in the email itself. But it has some interesting warning flags. One is RBI apparently has, it also has a photo of the then RBI governor, Raghuram Rajan. But then it has this interesting attribute that RBI apparently has outlook.com email address, right? So those are some telltale signs that this is a phishing, this is a suspicious email, and you probably should not be sending your confidential data to that address. So the next category is Trojanized software. So the term Trojan horse relates to the Greek mythology, where people hid inside a wooden horse to enter Troy, right? And essentially the same concept applies here. A malicious program masquerades as a legitimate software. You might have seen either your parents or somebody else saying, hey, I keep getting these annoying pop-ups that say that there is a problem with your PC, right? There is you need a tune-up, oil change for your computer. And click here and we'll solve the problem. And what it will do is, it will pretend like it's actually fixing a problem. It will scan the registry files, it will scan your file system, it will report, it will give you a nice report that says, we found 28 threats on your PC. And you need to pay something to be able to clean it up, right? What is happening there is essentially a rogue, it's also called rogueware. A rogue software is pretending like it's doing something legitimate when it's not. And most recently, this has been tremendously effective. You all probably heard about the MongoDB security issue that flared up last week. Yeah? more than 10,000 MongoDB instances that are publicly facing, which means they're accessible through the internet, were compromised by attackers. And all of the data from the MongoDB database was scraped and deleted, and they left only one record in the database, which is how much to pay and whom to pay in Bitcoins. Yeah? In fact, it was so interesting that attackers were stomping over each other. So you would see one instance where Syndicate A would first compromise a vulnerable. By vulnerable, really, it was actually embarrassingly stupid. Many people left their MongoDB instances with no root password, admin password. Think about it, right? As simple as it sounds, that was very effective. And you would see that after Syndicate A compromised a machine, somebody else would log in and overwrite that message saying you have to pay me. And there are instances where people actually paid a particular entity and then found out they don't have your data. They didn't have the data, so in some cases the data was permanently lost. So this trend of compromising your machine and asking for ransom is actually a pretty big. It happens both at the consumer level, which is, you lose access to your photos or your files or your documents that you store in your PC. They would encrypt your hard drive and then ask for a ransom. There was a very interesting New York Times article that came out, I think like early 2016, early last year. So if you haven't read it, it's a fantastic read. It is written by a reporter, I think, whose mother's PC was attacked and asked for ransom. And she talks about the story where they had to pay in Bitcoins, and she didn't even know how to do it. How do you convert dollars to Bitcoins? They didn't know, right? So ransomware is actually a pretty big trend and a concern right now. And typically the types of things that you would see Trojanized are things that are of very high value to the attacker. So for example, if you all heard about the tool Putty, which is usually used to log into remote servers from a Windows laptop. Why is this a high value target? This is a high value target because what do you do with the Putty? Who uses Putty the most? System administrators. What do they do with it? They log into remote servers and type your credentials. So what they do is they compile Putty from the exact same open source, and then they will host it on a rogue website. So unless you are paying close attention to the actual about box, if you see here, it says unidentified build. Unless you're actually paying close attention, you would actually think you're using Putty. Even advanced system administrators have fallen for this attack. And the other reason why this is very effective is because a lot of the host-based firewalls and IDS devices, they whitelist Putty. Because if you look at the behavior of the program, it looks very much like a regular Putty program. So anything that is doing behavioral analysis, static file analysis, the executable content will look very similar. So generally it is whitelisted by IDSs and firewalls. And hence this particular technique is very, very effective. So the next thing is exploiting vulnerabilities. This has been around for a very, very long time, I would say more than 15 years. But generally speaking, vulnerability, all software that is ever written has bugs. And a vulnerability is essentially a defect in the software that allows an attacker to gain access or elevate privilege or do something that is unintended, right? So the analogy to the physical world is that if you are trying to protect a home, you have valuables stored inside a home, an open window is a vulnerability, right? Because somebody can get in. The fact that a thief actually goes through the open window and steals something is an exploit, right? So that's exactly what happens. People craft an attack payload. If you have a buffer overflow vulnerability in your code, the exploiter will actually craft the payload to be able to exploit that vulnerability, cause the buffer overflow, transfer the execution to his function, and then execute his code. That is the actual exploit. But the type of exploit that is highly effective and has been the root cause for a variety of large-scale data breaches over the last 3 to 4 years is the concept of a zero-day exploit. So imagine you're walking around the house, you're trying to secure your house, and you notice all the open windows or doors or points of entry into the house. But then you completely miss one portion of the house. You don't even know that there is a way to get in. So this is an instance where the software vendor themselves don't know that they have a vulnerability. See, typically what happens is, once a vulnerability is disclosed, once somebody sees an open window, they run to the store, buy a lock and lock it. Essentially, they go and patch the software. By the time they go to the store, if somebody gets in, that really means that there is an unpatched system, and the attacker was able to use that window between the time the vulnerability was disclosed and the time the software was patched to be able to gain entry into the system. Yeah? But a 0-day is far more effective and actually very dangerous, because the software vendor does not even know about the vulnerability, so there is no chance of patching it. You don't even know the window is open. You don't even know that an intrusion has actually happened. You may not know that data has been exfiltrated. And by the time you know, it could be too late. So hence, 0-day exploits are very, very impactful. And a lot of the software firms actually conduct the so-called hackathons, yeah, where they actually pay even bounty to white hat hackers to proactively find 0-day exploits in their code. These are things they don't know about. So they would rather have a white hat hacker identify those things to them rather than somebody actually exploiting their system and stealing the data. Okay, so the next category is this concept of man in the middle. So this is the plain old problem of somebody eavesdropping on your conversation. So typically in the physical world, if you want to say something confidential, we naturally lower our voice, right? We try to whisper. And the reason we do that is because we don't want somebody else to hear the conversation. It's far more complicated in the online world because, first of all, do you even know that you are talking to the right entities? If A wants to communicate to B, how does A know that it is actually talking to B? That B is the intended recipient of your message. Second is, how are you sure that the data is confidential and not being exposed to another third party C? And the problem with this is that you don't even know what systems your data is passing through, right? The third problem is integrity. How do we know that that whatever message was being transmitted was not tampered with as the message went from A to B? And finally, especially relevant for asynchronous communication, how do we know that B has access to the data when he or she needs to use it? So these are the four main sort of sub-problems as we think about man in the middle. And we'll talk about some of the solutions that are used to solve some of these challenges as well. So lastly, data security. We all use some kind of cloud software. We back up our photos, documents online. We shop online, things like that. And anybody who has been paying any attention to the news in the last 4 or 5 years, you have noticed that there have been several high-profile breaches, right? High-profile breaches across a variety of sectors: retail, healthcare, tech, and these have really been very, very impactful for those organizations. So this is a real concern. Data security is a real concern. And the problem here is that we don't even know how much information is being stored. So if you're using a phone from a particular handset manufacturer, what data is being collected, personal data is being collected from your phone? Do you know that? Do you know that if there is a history of geolocations you have visited that is being collected? Well, if it's being collected, somehow if you know that, do you know where it's stored? Like physically, where does it stored? Where is it stored? Who has access to the data? What are the access control mechanisms that are available? And most importantly, this is where a lot of the organizations are actually not ready or ill-equipped, is what happens when the data is stolen? See, for a lot of the organizations, they think it is an if, not a when. Because they think it's an if, they are not prepared or they are underprepared to deal with a data breach when it happens. So unless an organization actually has clearly laid out policies and tools to be able to handle a situation like that, they may not be able to, one, assess the impact, like how much data was stolen, Who has taken the data? Do we have a backup of the data? So all of these are some important challenges as we think about data security. Next, we'll briefly talk about IoT. So as we all know, IoT is a big trend right now. And there are two separate domains to think about. One is consumer IoT, which is this whole concept of a connected home. Everything in your home is online. And then there is industrial IoT, which actually is a pretty major transformation as well in the industrial space. There is talk about having essentially lights out, for example, factory floor management, right? Completely automated, assembly lines and things like that. And the scale is staggering. I think it's unlike anything we have seen in the last 15 years. Gartner estimates 26 billion devices in the next 3 years by 2020, and that is a 30x increase from 2009. So there's a significant growth. Now, what is the problem with this hyperscale? The problem with this hyperscale is that even small problems, even solved problems in the PC and mobile space becomes a big concern as you go into IoT. So a very simple thing is, how do I patch 1 billion devices? Let's say I identify a very critical software vulnerability in the device manufacturer's software. Do I have the mechanism and the ability to patch 1 billion devices quickly? Right? This is not a small challenge. The second is that even a very, very small error rate, let's say you have a policy enforcement engine that's running on these embedded devices. Even a very small error rate, like a 0.01% error rate, means that potentially millions of devices are exposed. And there is huge commerce that's going to be happening. If you have your dishwasher that is connected online, the dishwasher might actually have access to your credit card information to be able to order parts if something breaks down. Because the promise to the user is that if the dishwasher or my fridge stops working, it automatically self-diagnoses what the problem is. It identifies that this is the defective part. It checks with its inventory control and finds out that that particular part is available and can be shipped on this day. It uses the credit card information, your credit card information stored on file, to make the order. It arranges for a service technician to come to your home on that day with the part and get it replaced. Right? Tremendous convenience. But if you think about the entities that are involved here, there is the appliance manufacturer. Typically, the backend for an IoT platform is hosted by a different entity. It could be hosted on a third-party cloud services provider. So suddenly you have 3 entities, and you don't know which entity has actually access to the data or where it's stored. Right? So tremendous amount of commerce is expected to be done on IoT devices, and hence it is a very interesting target for attackers. Right? It's a huge opportunity. And then lastly, one other thing to realize is that these devices are typically have very low power profile and typically CPU profile, and security is a tax. It's like nobody wants to pay tax, but you have to do it. And security is like that. Nobody is excited about buying a security product, right? It's something that has to be done. And the problem is because it consumes resources from whatever device you're using, phone or PC. And the other challenge here is that some of the low power devices have extremely low resource capabilities to be able to do some of the advanced techniques we'll talk about. Okay, so what we have done so far is we have covered some of the key challenges that we expect to have as we think about establishing trust online. So the next question is, how do we address these challenges? So before I talk about specific solutions, I want to give a big picture view, which is this concept called defense in depth, or you might have also heard about this term called layered security. What it is that you identify control points in your IT infrastructure where you can either enforce policy or detect threats. Okay? And you use the best available tools in each of these control points to cover as much of the threat space as possible. The important thing here is that you are not worried about overlap. So if you look at the universe of threats, and you look at three main control points in an IT infrastructure, it is the endpoint itself, your PC, your laptop, your phone, your tablet. Then there is a network, and then you have typically a cloud backend or some sort of a service backend. Three control points. And you will use the best possible tools in all of these control points. And even if you look at the universe of threats and you draw a Venn diagram of coverage of your threats, you are not worried about overlap. A same class of threat might be detectable at the PC and at the cloud. That is generally not an issue. And the reason is that this is a highly agile and a transforming space. The threat landscape changes significantly every 12 to 15 months. So if you think you have certain coverage for a class of threats, the threat might have evolved and you may not. And hence, you try to do the best possible in all of these three control points. So this is defense in depth or layered security. And here are the techniques that are typically employed in each of these, and we'll talk about this in more detail. At the endpoint level, we will talk about file scanning, so-called static and behavioral analysis, and then a recent trend called application containers, which uses hypervisors to ensure high level of security. And then on the network, deep packet inspection, this has been around for a very long time. Network policy enforcement. A recent trend is called application emulation. We'll look at what that is. And then, of course, you can also, this is a very effective place to do anti-spam and anti-phishing protection. And then, finally, the cloud is very interesting. This has taken off in the last 4 to 5 years. Cloud-based protection is sort of an essential component for any security strategy for an enterprise. Why? Because all of these endpoints are sending security telemetry to the cloud, and then you can do a lot of things, log analytics. We'll cover some of the ML techniques that are actually quite effective. And also, because you have more compute and storage available in the cloud, you can do some things that are not possible to be done on the network or on the PC. So this is sort of gives you a big picture of how to think about your overall security posture as you think about securing users and data in your enterprise. Okay, so let's start with network-based protection. So what is this deep packet inspection? Simply put, it is an ability to tap into a network, scan traffic, and recompose flows at various levels of your networking stack. So this includes L3, L4, and L7. L4 means your TCP, the state machine that you are tracking inside the appliance is fully stateful. Yeah? And then at layer 7, typically what is done is you do a combination of protocol decode and you track the HTTP state. So if you are essentially inspecting traffic going from a web server to a web browser to a web server, you actually have a lot of context about what that HTTP transaction is about. Once you do this, some of the techniques that are used is, one is called anomaly detection. Anomaly detection, essentially you're looking for things that are unusual or suspicious. So for example, if you have a state tracking machine that is tracking ICMP type and protocol codes, typically you expect to see pings and ping responses, echo and echo replies, and all of a sudden you see a completely unused ICMP type or code. What could that mean? That could actually be a backdoor communication channel. That could be an infected host trying to communicate to a command and control server. Yeah? So, and then port scan and port sweeps are also common forms of anomaly detection. So the next thing that you can do is called content analysis, which is once you are able to decode the HTTP protocol state, you are able to extract the actual content that is going through. It could be a GIF file or a PDF file or executable file, and you actually type it. And what you will find out is that when you type, it gives you more information to do anomaly detection. For example, if you look at this HTTP transaction, this is the GET request, and then you see the response. The content disposition says this is a GIF file, d9d3.gif, okay? And then there's content length, which looks not unusual. But then, if you have a file typing capability, if you actually inspect the payload, that is essentially a PE file, the portable executable file header for Windows programs. So once you type this, an anomaly engine would say, wait a minute, the content disposition says it's a GIF file. The browser might try to render it as a GIF file. The user might open it using a GIF rendering program. But what will happen is they might be executing arbitrary code, likely malicious code. Right? So this is an example of how you can do anomaly detection if you know what file content is being transmitted over the channel. Okay. The other things you can do with the network-based, and by far network-based continues to be a very effective and key control point. There is a lot of innovation and activity in this space and has been over the last 10 plus years. This is because there are so many types of techniques you can employ here. So the next technique is policy enforcement. This is typically used by large corporations where they take a policy decision. So for example, they'll say block all BitTorrent traffic, right? Why? Because one, there is no business use for my users to be using BitTorrent. Second is most likely the BitTorrent is being used to distribute malicious code or pirated music or whatever, right? So I just want to blanket block all BitTorrent traffic. So it allows you to take these sort of policy decisions at the network. So the more recent trend that we are seeing is called application emulation. So what this does is that typically an appliance is deployed at the egress or the ingress point in your network. It is scanning all incoming traffic. It is able to decode the protocol and extract the file content. If it's email, it's able to decode MIME, extract the MIME attachment. If it's HTTP, it's able to extract the HTTP payload. And it not only types it, but it does limited emulation. And what that means is that it actually spawns a VM and it executes the executable, it opens the executable, the attachment in the VM. So if it's a PDF file, it actually has a vulnerable version of, for example, a PDF reader, and it tries to open it using that inside the VM. And then they look for signs of infection. They look for unusual registry keys that are being created, file system accesses, network communications, IRC channels, things like that. And then they deduce that something similar might have happened on the endpoint. So this technique is called application emulation. And this is very effective compared to signature-based matching, because you don't need to know what the exploit is. All you're trying to find out is, it's a black box view. All you're trying to find out is, if I open this file, will I get infected or not? Right? So it is actually effective in catching zero-day exploits, which is otherwise very hard to detect. And finally, network-based protection has been the primary control point for anti-spam and anti-phishing detection for a very, very long time. This is a fairly, I don't want to say evolved, but this is a very mature space. Spam detection uses both regular expression-based matching. There is heavy use of ML in the last 4 years, very, very effective in being able to detect malicious spam. They also actually do a thing called URL scanning, which is once they decode the MIME and extract your email content, they're able to scan for all the links in the email, and they would use URL-based reputations techniques to actually assess the reputation of those URLs. So if they find that the content of the email is talking about a bank, but the link actually goes to an unreputed or untrusted IP address, they will immediately flag that as a phishing email. So that is one of the very common techniques used in anti-phishing. Okay, so that's network-based protection. There's two more. Yeah, so the other sort of user-facing things is multi-factor authentication. I think all of us are familiar with OTPs. We get a lot of them from our banks and other places. Essentially, multi-factor authentication means that you use several methods of independent authentication. So remember, I talked about what you know and what you have, right? What you know might be a password. What you have might be the OTP token that comes on your phone, right? What you have might be your fingerprint. What you have might be your face, right? If it's capable of doing facial recognition. So multi-factor authentication generally provides a higher level of security in terms of authentication than others. Transport layer security, this has been essentially a solved problem for a very, very long time, but it still is an issue because of improper configuration. Setting up a properly configured TLS infrastructure that provides authentication, integrity, and confidentiality, while it's theoretically possible, SSL has been around for a very long time, this is still a concern because people don't know how to configure it. This is why some of the PaaS services are gaining adoption, because you don't even have to think about how do I procure a certificate, how do I get it signed, how do I chain a certificate to the root, to a trusted certificate authority, right? All of these are essentially non-trivial problems from an administrative perspective. And hence some of the PaaS services will give you this package. It will say, pick your domain, we'll take care of everything else. And you can go and essentially access your web service behind a HTTPS infrastructure. So that's TLS. Now let's look at client. So we talked about network. Second is client. Client is a slightly older, basically has been around for even longer than the network. The most traditional form of client-based protection is called signature detection, which is essentially fingerprint matching. They scan for files in their file system, and they look for patterns in those files. And there are some advanced techniques where you actually do some limited emulation. So most of the threads come packed nowadays, so you actually have unpackers that would try to unpack and see what the executable content is. And there are also techniques to write the so-called generic signatures, which identify a class of threads as opposed to a specific thread. Generally, the idea is that you are able to intercept a file system create or an execute activity, and you are able to scan the content for something that is malicious. Most recently, this has not been effective. Why? Because there is emergence of a new type of thread called polymorphic threads. See, earlier what used to happen is if there is an infected web server and 1,000 users go to that website, all 1,000 users will get the same copy of the executable, exact same copy of the executable. And hence, it was easy for the antivirus vendors to be able to write a signature that detects that particular variant, and it's effective on all those 1,000 machines. But polymorphic threat means that the threat is highly customized for every user. If 50 users go to an infected website, those 50 users can get a unique copy of the executable. It does the same thing. It will steal whatever the intent of the program is, it's still the same. It is malicious. But you'll get 50 separate copies, and hence it's polymorphic. So you can't write a signature for it, right? Even if you write a signature, it's going to protect one user in the world, which is actually quite useless. So things that evolved from this are called static and behavioral analysis. Now what they try to do is they try to use heuristics to essentially predict the intent of a program. Predicting the intent of a program is actually pretty hard, what it's going to do. And essentially they use heuristics to be able to do that. And they use a combination of static and dynamic and behavioral. Behavioral essentially means that you let a process run. Static is even before the process executes, you are able to scan the content and predict the intent. In behavioral analysis, you let the process run and you watch its behaviors. Does it spawn another process? Why is a PDF reader spawning another executable file? It has no business creating an executable file. Yeah? That is an anomalous activity. Does it intercept network connections? That is open sockets. Who does it connect to? Is it using IRC? Right? All of these are aspects of behavioral analysis that they use to actually detect if something malicious or suspicious is going on. So in the client space, one of the recent techniques that has come up and is actually quite effective is this concept called application partitions. As the hardware capabilities at the processor level, mainly VTX and VTD, so virtualization at the CPU and the I/O layer happened, it allowed security software vendors to actually create isolated partitions protected by a type 0 hypervisor that could segment different types of activities going on in your PC. Say for example that you do two things on your laptop. You go to Facebook, you check email. Then you go to your bank and do something. So what we do is we categorize this into secure and everything else. Potentially risky behavior. So all of your Facebook activity, checking email, browsing, reading news, all that stuff happens on your, say, partition A. Whenever you go to a bank or you're going to use your credit card to check out your shopping cart, it happens in partition B. And by partition I actually mean literally it's a separate VM. And even if the risky partition gets infected, the infection cannot spill over to stealing your bank credentials because there is hardware-assisted isolation provided by the hypervisor, right? So this is a fairly new technique and actually is effective in certain situations. Okay, so we talked about network and we talked about client. Last thing I want to talk about is cloud-based protection. So security log analytics is the primary technique used here. There is telemetry that's collected from a number of different security devices and is used to build and train ML models. There are two techniques that are actually fairly effective that I'll talk about them, and this span both supervised and unsupervised learning techniques. In supervised learning, decision trees is actually quite effective. The other reason decision trees is popular is because you can also reason about it. Like you can actually look at the tree and say, okay, I think I know why the model is trying to classify this threat as malicious, right? And decision trees are effective in actually classifying, for example, executable files. In one instance, even before a file is downloaded and executed on your PC, without inspecting a single byte in the file, an ML model is able to predict if the file is malicious or not, simply just based on file attributes. How many other users have the file, where was it downloaded from, and things like that. In unsupervised learning, sometimes there is not enough training data. Oh, by the way, training data is a very big concern in security. Unlike other ML domains, machine learning domains, where there is access to, public access to training data, in the security space, this is a very big challenge. We do not have access to high quality and high quantity ground truth. And this makes supervised learning a big challenge. And hence, unsupervised learning is fairly popular. In particular, things like k-means clustering is very effective. For example, if you are scanning an email and extracting all the URLs, you can simply run it through a clustering engine to classify potentially malicious or suspicious URLs versus everything else. And if you start labeling your clusters based on manual analysis, then you might be able to predict if a new URL that you have not seen gets clustered into one of the suspicious domains. So unsupervised learning is quite effective as well. The other interesting attribute about log analytics is that even if you don't use machine learning for prediction, the metadata you have collected about entities is useful in acting as a corroboration engine for some of the static and dynamic heuristics we talked about. What is the problem with heuristics? The problem with heuristics is that they have a very high FP rate. It's hard to pick the right point in the ROC curve. So if you have something that is highly effective, high TP rate may also come with a high FP rate. And using something that's completely orthogonal to a client-based scanning, so instead of doing scanning files on a PC, trying to use telemetry from the cloud allows you to essentially use it as a corroboration engine. The other simpler techniques that are used is just a blacklist, whitelist repository. They collect file hashes, IP addresses, URLs, and maintain this blacklist, whitelist. The more recent trend in this space is this concept called automated application analysis. Because there is elastic compute and storage available, there are things you can do in the cloud that you can't on the network device or on the endpoint. So for example, you can essentially have a VM farm that does automated APK analysis. So you can collect a bunch of Android APKs, unpack them, disassemble them, and then you can do, for example, permissions analysis. So for example, why does an APK that claimed to be a game, right, wants to access all of your contacts or wants to read the IMEI information from your phone? That is very unusual. And you can also do limited dynamic analysis. You can let the APK run. There are tools that allows you to essentially use a VM to act like a mobile phone. And then you can see if that context is being sent to some untrusted party. So these are some of the techniques in cloud-based protection. So in summary, let's look at some of the key best practices and techniques. Use multi-factor authentication wherever possible. And a well-configured TLS is table stakes. TLS is a very mature and highly reliable technology, and it's fairly effective. Keep your machines always patched and update. When you get those annoying notifications to update your software, it's actually very, very important, especially if it's a critical software vulnerability, that you get it patched or update. Third-party software downloads continue to be a major source of ransomware and rogueware. So where possible, verify provenance before you install. Make sure that you're actually installing putty and not something else. And also watch out for things that are called so-called freeware that even get preloaded with, in some cases, with your phones. Some of these could be doing suspicious activities. And finally, be extremely careful when you click attachments, when you open attachments or click links, and watch out for anomalies that we talked about, like misleading file names and extensions. Okay? With that, thank you very much for listening.
The floor is now open to questions.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
That was an interesting talk. I would like to ask you, like, for example, you have told about deep packet inspection. With the high volume of traffic and the high speed of packets that are coming into the detection engine, is deep packet inspection still a viable option for proactive detection? Or is it only for forensic analysis now? And one more thing, is machine learning technique effective for zero-day attacks?
Okay. So two separate questions. First question, I think it's a very good one. Especially with ever-increasing network speeds, especially at the enterprise core and the backbone layers, is it still viable to do deep packet inspection? The short answer is yes. The slightly long form of the answer is that the way we do deep packet inspection has significantly changed. 10 years ago, this was a software problem. Essentially what happened is, we would write software that disassembles the packets, creates the TCP UDP flows, and does protocol state inspection. What has happened is that this problem has moved to hardware. There is a class of processors called network processors that are based mostly on MIPS chipset. MIPS is highly effective in byte-aligned matching. And these chipsets provide very high advanced capabilities. So for example, some of them even provide regular expression scanning. So essentially what has happened is it is a combination of software and hardware now. Layer 3, layer 4 disassembly, and layer 7 regular expression matching has been offloaded to hardware. Whatever you can't do there, for example, if you are doing like a Boyer-Moore match, if you are doing a sliding match, that gets offloaded to an AMD or an x86 processor, right? So that is essentially the way the industry has evolved dealing with high traffic. And also, a deep packet inspection doesn't actually mean that you have to inspect everything deeply. There are also techniques to selectively bypass traffic that have high confidence, typically based on source or destination. I know it's coming from a trusted source, so I'm going to skip that flow, right? So these are some of the techniques that are used to still cope up with the network speed. Your second question was regarding ML and is it effective in zero-day attacks, and the answer is yes. And the reason it's effective is because it's not trying to essentially identify what the vulnerability is and see if the exploit is using that vulnerability. Machine learning techniques typically, especially the cloud-based ones, are using information that is completely orthogonal to the vulnerability space, right? And in behavioral analysis, it's only looking at the output behavior. So for example, it doesn't matter how an image rendering program got infected. What matters is the fact that it created an executable, or it matters the fact that it is opening an IRC channel to IRC server that is of very questionable reputation. So detecting them using traditional techniques is hard, but using ML techniques where you're using different dimensions and different data is actually quite effective. Yes.
Can you create a sort of a customized, personalized security assistant online? I mean, it learns my online behavior and then tells me what I should do and collects the necessary software needed for this, and sort of it is fine-tuned to my behavior and my usage of the system.
So, so the underlying sort of intuition behind your question is already employed by some endpoint security software. Because it's installed on your laptop, it actually has access to essentially your browsing history, application usage patterns, what applications you typically use, what sort of activities you do. It is not advanced to the level where it can be called an assistant, where it is actually giving you sound advice. Because for the most part, this is a very hard problem, and it requires a combination of human and machine intelligence to solve it, right? And it's a constantly evolving space. So it may not get to the point where it's like a shopping assistant that tells you that you should buy, this. But I think some of the underlying techniques are already being used to personalize. And this is how, when I talked about the backend as a corroboration engine, the client actually sends some very specific information to the cloud about that particular PC's characteristics. Of course, it's all anonymized and things like that. But yes, that technique is sort of in use. There's one more question from you. Yes.
Yeah. See, when you detect the threat, can you not consider counterattack or misfeeding or misleading information feeding to the source as a way of this thing? Cause a damage to the source.
Yeah, so there are two aspects there. One is essentially causing damage to the source. The second aspect is proactively luring attackers. And the second one is actually quite popular, actually was quite popular a long time ago. It's being revived now. It's called honeypots. So what honeypots are is that you intentionally deploy unpatched, vulnerable software onto your internet-facing infrastructure by design. But then you cordon it off completely from a networking perspective. And when you get infected, you actually gain information about the attacker. You track the source IP address. You watch for techniques used. This is not a publicly available service, but a lot of the security companies actually use this to collect information about spam campaigns. This is how sometimes they have tremendous information about the spam campaign. They'll say that this particular earthquake happened in Haiti and there are this many emails that came out, and this is the exact, how do they know? They know because they actually have honeypot email accounts that receive those spam emails.
This kind of techniques are very popularly used in military, intelligence, like either blank it out or misfeed information or destroy the code.
Absolutely.
So why is it not much talked about as an approach to doing it?
Yeah, it has got a lot of academic traction. There's a lot of papers written on this, but it has not yet had widespread industrial adoption. In part, it is because it comes with a very high maintenance, right? Because for you to continue to operate this, keep in mind the attackers are constantly improving and evolving their techniques as well. I'll give you a simple example. One of the honeypot techniques that were used was to run VMs, emulate exe files, portable executable files inside a VM. Immediately, within months, the attackers had VM detection code in their software. So they immediately knew that this is a honeypot. And it is very interesting. You should see, the moment they detect they're running inside a VM, it will act like a normal program. The moment it runs on bare metal, it will do its business. So there is a cat and mouse game happening here, which is why maintaining honeypot infrastructure is hard at a commercial scale, but definitely it's happening inside the security company's infrastructure, because they need to collect intelligence. Yes, so some other question here, yes.
A couple of questions. Like for instance, you said there are many players involved and one person does the servicing and stuff like that. I heard that there's something coming up called blockchain. Is it already implemented or adopted? That's one of the questions.
So I was talking about that in the context of IoT.
Okay.
That there are variety of players involved. There is the appliance or the device manufacturer, then the provider of the device software, and there is a backend for the IoT and the cloud services provider, right? So there are many entities involved, and hence it is difficult to track where the data is.
So is this a technology that's coming up or adopted or blockchain?
No, blockchain is not a direct answer to that particular problem. Blockchain solves other problems, especially blockchain is having a lot of traction in the financial industry. Surprisingly, financial industry has been one of the most conservative. If you look at the fintech sector, it's one of the most conservative IT segments you can think about, right? But there has been adoption of blockchain. In fact, even an open source project called Hyperledger. And the reason is the cost of compliance is increasing, both KYC as well as anti-money laundering. And blockchain solves that problem. So it doesn't directly address the fragmentation issue in IoT.
Okay. So it cannot be adopted for this? I mean,
it can be.
Because it solves that kind of a problem, right? I mean, there are multiple financial players involved and it tries to solve that problem. Why can't we take that solution to this?
It is possible. There is not enough industry incentive. This is my personal opinion. Okay. In the IoT space, there is not enough. It's actually a land grab right now, right? So security is not top of mind, and there is a land grab. But if we can establish a central registry for storing and sharing data, I think it could be effective.
Good. Thank you.
Due to lack of time, let us take the questions offline. Now I request the Honorable Chairperson to hand over the memento to the Speaker.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Unfortunately, I couldn't get into depth in many of the areas, but